Lionel Logue was my grandfather, and he, as you all know, is the King's speech therapist. And he was someone that, although I knew, what he was as a child, I knew that he was the King's speech therapist. That's about all I knew. And I didn't know that he kept a diary. I didn't know that the extent to which he was the King's speech therapist, or how early he started being the King's speech therapist, or how long it ran for. So I knew nothing, and all of this was a complete discovery.
Feel the looseness of the jaw. Good, little bounces, bounces. Shoulders loose, shoulders loose.
Pops up in 1981 when David Seidler wrote to my uncle, Valentine, asking for permission to access the archives when he first started researching into this story. Valentine forwarded the request on to Clarence House for the Queen Mother to respond to, because ever since 1969, ever since there was another book written, that they developed a relationship between the Logues and Buckingham Palace or Clarence House about what to do in the event of someone wanting access to the diaries. And so this agreement was established where the Logues would forward any inquiries onto Clarence House. Anyway, the Queen Mother responded to David Seidler, flatly refusing access to the diaries, stating that she found the memories too painful and that she'd rather the film wasn't made in her lifetime. And that's the kind of credo that the Logues followed out of sort of respect to her and to the memory of the King, that they wouldn't allow access to the diaries unless it came with her permission. And that, I think, underlines the reason why, ever since the King died, that there hasn't been any access given. It was given once in 1958 to John Wheeler Bennett, who wrote the official biography, again in the late 60s to a chap who wrote a biography about or the history of Harley Street. That was the last time that the diaries got accessed for a book. Ever since after that, then all you get is references to John Wheeler Bennett's biography and the references to it in there, but never to the actual diaries. So that's the last time it saw the light of day, and after that it was boxed up, put in an attic and forgotten about. The first time I came across it all was in 2001 after my dad passed away. I came across this big filing cabinet full of papers and letters stuffed inside document wallets and boxes, and started reading them and discovered the diaries and the letters and medals and all sorts of stuff with royal crests. I stuffed them away in a box and kind of forgot about them for another 6 years, and then resumed interest in them again. And then 2009, I get a call from Ian Canning, the film's producer, saying that they'd be very interested in meeting me, and what did I have, in the way of information to give them to help them with the character of Lionel Logue in the film. And I told them I had the diaries.
My husband has seen everyone, to no avail. Awfully afraid he's given up hope.
He hasn't seen me.
Logue first became a speech therapist. Logue cut his cloth in training or rehabilitating soldiers returning from the First World War, soldiers suffering from shell shock, with the psychological effects of shell shock, not being able to talk through some kind of trauma, mental trauma, and other soldiers returning with physical damage to their vocal cords from mustard gas attacks. And so he developed a series of techniques, breathing exercises, vocal coaching, and also combined with a kind of background in teaching elocution at school, and also being a performer on stage himself in Perth and Adelaide. With all of this combination of things, I think that is what sort of like taught him the ropes, taught him the kind of like spectrum of sort of little techniques that he came to Britain with. From the very first time the King was asked by his father to make a speech, that was famously an absolute disaster.
I have received.
I was deeply scarred by that. The following speech after that he made at Canberra, which was a great success thanks to Logue's therapy in the months before. And the Duke always relied heavily on Logue for his confidence, for his ability to make speeches, for his ability to face the microphone and to face crowds, psychological support as well as vocal training and breathing and overcome, giving the Duke and then the King the tools to kind of prevent him from stammering or to block the stammer, the sliding into words and the forced breathing and the speaking on the exhale and all these techniques that stammerers use. They can all be heard in the film, and they're also present in the speeches that Logue would annotate and alter for the King to be able to put in edits into the actual speech that he would read in order to give him little cues as to where to introduce a sort of a hesitation and where to slide into another word. They're all kind of marked out on the page for him to crib from. The Duke of York first came to see Logue in October 19th, 1926, and from that appointment onwards, the Duke saw him pretty much every day for the first couple of months.
Well, I believe when speaking with the Prince, one waits for the Prince to choose the topic. Waiting for me to commence a conversation, one can wait rather a long way.
He saw them about 50 times in quick succession, all the way through November, December, and into January. January the 5th, I think, he embarked on his world tour to go and open Parliament in Canberra. But during that time, those 50 appointments, they developed quite a close relationship. The letters indicate that, the Duke of York is writing to Logue. His letters say, my dear Logue, and he's talking about the confidence that he's given him for his trip. He's saying things like, without your help, I'd never be able to do this. And Logue, in turn, is writing sort of encouraging words about him. As long as he keeps up his exercises, he won't go back. And so I think their friendship is forged in those first few months. When he returns from his trip, some months later, they resume letter writing and he resumes his appointments with Logue throughout the 20s, and they keep a correspondence going. In fact, a correspondence which never really diminishes in the 25 years that they knew each other. The letters are all about the friendship. Logue sends him a letter with a book every birthday. The book is usually about, Logue is a proud Australian, and so he's trying to educate the King into, early colonial Australia, or the early settlers and the adventurers and all this kind of Australian sort of history, which the King loves. He loves that kind of stuff. Logue, of course, once the Duke becomes King, is then kind of propelled into a kind of like a higher order of importance than his therapy.
Thank you, Mr. Churchill. Sir.
The King continued seeing Logue throughout the war after 1939 to coach him through the speeches he had to make, through the Christmas broadcasts. He was at Sandringham every year for the Christmas broadcast, sort of in the room, present in the room with him for just about every broadcast. In fact, 1944 was the first broadcast since he became king that he ever had without Logue there. Logue decided the room on the first floor opposite the King's study was an excellent room for broadcasting because it looked out onto the main quadrangle and was very quiet. The steward had discovered an old desk in the basement which had been covered with baize and its sloping lid raised up by 2 blocks of wood until the top was level. 2 gilt microphones and a red light were mounted between them. "We have tried sitting down, but he is better on his feet," Logue wrote. "He is indeed a gallant figure, and if a word doesn't quite go right, he looks at me so pathetically and then gets on with the job. There is very little wrong with him. The only big thing is fear." And this fear he talks about is the fear of the microphone, purely and simply, and also the fear of the red broadcasting light flashing in his eyes. Logue had it rigged so that it would flash when the broadcast was getting ready, and then would turn off during the broadcast and then on again at the end when he was clear, so that he wouldn't have to stare at the red light, so it was reminding him that he was live. Logue was always there, was always by his side. In fact, there's a joke made that Woods, the King and Logue in the room together after a broadcast, Woods turns to the King and says, I suppose you know, you'll be making this speech by television soon, sir. And the King turns to Logue and says, well, you'll have to be under the table then, Logue. You know, the inference being that as long as he's nearby, the King can carry on making the speeches.
Forget everything else and just say it to me. Say it to me as a friend.
Later on, when the King starts making speeches on his own, he wrote in his diary, you know, I feel like a father bereft of his son, you know, because there's a sense that he has always been by his side through every speech, and now, you know, his son is confident enough to do them on his own. Logue writes in his diary, as they sat in the study with the fire burning, the King suddenly said, Logue, I think the time has come when I can do a broadcast by myself, and you can have Christmas dinner with your family. Logue had been expecting this moment for some time, especially since the Home Guard speech. They discussed the matter thoroughly with the Queen, who agreed they should give it a try. So instead of Logue, it was decided that for the first time, she and 2 princesses would sit beside the King at the microphone as he delivered the message. You know, Ma'am, I feel like a father who is sending his boy to his first public school, Logue told the Queen as he went to go. I know just how you feel, she replied, putting a hand on his arm and patting it. Logue, spending his first Christmas at home for several years, celebrated with a house party. John Gordon of the Sunday Express and his wife were among the guests. Logue was so busy with all the preparations that he scarcely thought about the speech, but at 5 minutes to 3 he slipped off into his bedroom. After saying a silent prayer, he turned on the radio softly, just in time. When the King's voice came through, Logue was astonished at how firm and resonant it was. It was 3 years since he had last heard him speak over a radio, and it sounded much better than Logue had remembered. He was speaking confidently and with good inflection and emphasis, and the breaks between words had all but disappeared. During the 8-minute message, he stopped only on one word, God, but it was only for a second, and when he continued, even more firmly than before. A letter arrives in 1951 from the King. Logue wasn't able to write back because he himself went into hospital for an operation. He returns home after the operation to find the letter unopened and the King dead. And he writes a letter to the Queen Mother at that point saying, I can't believe that this is the last letter I'll ever receive from the King. The King's letter is in front of me as I write, and I cannot realise that it is the last one I shall ever receive. Since 1926, he honoured me by allowing me to help him with his speech, and no man ever worked as hard as he did and achieved such a grand result. He gets a letter a month later from the Queen Mother saying, just sort of a beautiful letter acknowledging the amount of help and the friendship he's had with the King. I think that I know, perhaps better than anyone, just how much you helped the King, not only with his speech, but through his whole life and outlook on life. I shall always be deeply grateful to you and all you did for him. He was such a splendid person, and I don't believe that he ever thought of himself at all. I did so hope that he might have been allowed a few years of comparative peace after the many anguished years he has had to battle through so bravely, but it was not to be. And it's just a beautiful bookend to the whole thing. Rather sad because Lionel dies about a year later himself after a long illness, and so, you know, it brings it all to an end. But and it's sadly the last time Logue is mentioned again. He's pretty much from that day on. He gets sort of annexed and placed as a kind of a footnote to that period of the King's life. He in his lifetime he was talked about and the stammer was talked about, but after the King's death it gets talked about less and less until, of course, until David Seidler's script surfaced. There was a strange little shrine in the house, like a couple of signed photographs from the King and pictures of my grandmother and my grandfather lying around on mantelpieces and on windowsills. But being a kid, I just totally took them for granted and never questioned why they were there or why this picture from the King was signed Albert or you know, what he did. I just took it for granted. And it was literally after my father passed away that I sort of came across this stuff and started asking questions. Sadly, without my father around, I couldn't get a lot of these questions answered. And of course, he was the last of the three brothers. He was the youngest, and so my uncles had gone as well. So I was left with this slight vacuum that that I had to go and fill with research and through you know, other ways. So it came together. But truly, I mean, you know, I don't know really, never having met him, I don't know what his personality was like. So that's the kind of the gap that's filled with Geoffrey Rush.